All right. Welcome back, Chelsea fans, to another episode of the London is Blue podcast. I have, of course, am your host, Nick, joined by Ben Jacobs for yet another special episode during the summer transfer window. Ben, how are you doing today?
Yeah, really well. Looking forward to starting my own preseason and coming over to America with Chelsea very soon. It's only a couple of weeks away now.
God, it's wild, isn't it? Dan and I were kind of plotting out the schedule through August, and we're like, oh God, we only have like 5 weeks until the season really starts now. Like, it is absolutely crazy, and it's crunch time, which is, I think both exciting and kind of like numbing to think that the season just ended.
It's one of those, though, isn't it, where when you have a season that doesn't quite reach the expectations of Champions League football, but you go straight into a Euros and a Copa America and for some an Olympics, the season comes around so soon, and a couple of wins and people forget about last season as far as managerial change or no Champions League, and they start saying, wait a minute, things are exciting. Hopefully things are going in the right direction. So you can look at it both ways, but it does feel like the football just hasn't stopped.
It absolutely hasn't stopped. A few Chelsea players kind of making it all the way to the end of these tournaments, which, is really fun. So far, congratulations.
Cucurella in particular, even though Gary Neville said they're never going to get to the Euro 2024 final with Cucurella at left back, and they get to the Euro 2024 final because Cucurella is their left back, or he's a big factor anyway. We're recording this, by the way, just before England, so we don't yet know whether my team are even through to the final, but Cucurella has been outstanding, hasn't he?
He really has been. Enzo reaching the Copa America final last night with Argentina as well. So lots of good stuff to cover. Of course, just want to put the call to action out that we appreciate you guys so much, and just wanted to make the call. If you haven't done a 5-star review yet, for whatever reason, please do that. It's one of the very few discovery tools that podcast apps let you have these days. So just wanted to call that out. If you can go to YouTube and hit subscribe on our YouTube channel, we are doing a lot more YouTube specific content. Actually done YouTube specific content with Ben on that channel. And so just making that a little bit more of a tailored experience for all of our YouTube fans out there. Of course, Discord is a great place to join for a deeper, richer conversation. And Sam's Dispatch over the summer has just been excellent. And so usually those come out Wednesdays unless we are bombarding him with podcasts to do. So that is the housekeeping done. Ben, I want to jump right into the official start of the Maresca era. I know that, I think his contract was July 1 when he was supposed to start, but he officially got to Cobham on the 8th, which was Monday. We're recording this on Wednesday. First couple of days, we've seen a lot of the standard preseason videos from Chelsea coming out. What have you kind of taken out of his first couple of days so far? And have there been any hints within the videos that you've been able to pick up as to what's going on with the size and strength of the squad that's already at Cobham?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, the media chance to grill Maresca will come, and I would imagine that will be before they go to America. But of course, You don't want to be competing with the narrative of the Euros, and a lot of journalists are away, and therefore the club interview makes a lot of sense because people want to hear from Maresca. And he said all of the right things. He was very clear that his style is rigid. He spoke about the Italian connection, and if he can continue that, then he's off to the right kind of track. And on top of that, he started saying very clearly that Chelsea need to win now, and therefore he understands the culture of the football club. Now, what's interesting is that virtually every single Chelsea manager under Clearlake Bowley has started saying Chelsea are serial winners and we must win now, and then 10 games in have pivoted slightly to, but it's a long-term project and we have to be patient. And Maresca is inheriting more of an advanced project, so there is a higher expectation that he has to hit the ground running. And you kind of have that paradox in football of long-term contract, long-term project. The manager's contract is in sync with the length of the project that it may take to really build sustained success to the tune, let's say, of Roman Abramovich type volume of trophies. And yet, at the same time, if he starts poorly, there's still going to be that same pressure in his first 12 months. And at that point, he'll be the one facing the media. And we wait and see whether he says, but it's a young squad, but it needs time, but we're still gelling, but I'm still new. So we had everything but the buts in that first interview. And I think all of the wording and the understanding of the club was not only clear and set the right tone, but came with a kind of calm authority, which I know that Maresca had at Leicester as well. So he's up for the challenge. He's the right kind of personality as well as manager to make things work. But he's speaking really before he's understood the project by being inside it, or before he's had any kind of pre-season. So let's wait and see whether his perspective develops or changes. But I think in that club interview, he said everything that you would expect. And I'm sure most fans were very pleased to hear it.
One thing that I think made particularly American fans have a chuckle was the trust the process messaging. Now, I think the reason why I call out American fans is because there's a very famous trust the process sort of message from the former architect of the Philadelphia 76ers, who drafted all sorts of great players, never got to see the process culminate in any sort of trophies, and was fired before the process was complete. And I just want to, kind of call that out, Ben, because, I think everyone can have different interpretations of that, right? And largely, Chelsea's ownership has said, trust the process, trust the process, trust the process, even if they haven't used those words specifically. That's been kind of we know what we're doing, it's going to happen. Just, some of that self-assurance that is out there is kind of interesting. Did you see that as a positive thing, or did you kind of hear the collective eye roll of a fan base that doesn't quite trust the process yet?
No, I think when someone comes in, they're never going to say anything other than they trust the model and the people running it above them. And
Sure.
Maresca knows his place in that model. And as a head coach, much like he was at Leicester, he understands there's certain things he inherits, there's certain plans above his head. And of course, there's that day-to-day and the now part of the project and the football department that he has a lot of control in. And people maybe think that this appointment, because he's come from Leicester and the Championship, is about somebody that is just going to fulfill the wishes of those above him. In other words, a yes man. But that really isn't Maresca. He's incredibly forthright, and he will argue his case, which is what you want, because as I've said many times, it's about a freedom to challenge. And the only way really you trust the process being in the process is debating the process. And that's why I kind of feel for every football fan, because football fans are so passionate, they pay hard-earned money, they want to be part of their club, but you're never going to be in that room debating it and hearing both sides and seeing someone play devil's advocate and realizing that no club ever has 100% unity in coming to a decision. There's always a healthy debate. And if you get the debate right and it is constructive, then eventually you reach a unified position, even if at the beginning of every single decision, people had completely different opinions. Whereas if everyone automatically says yes, or if everyone's at loggerheads and it isn't constructive criticism, it's just a bunch of egos that don't fit, you're also never going to get anywhere. So it's a fine balance, and Liverpool get it right, and Chelsea are still building that dynamic. So it's as important in pre-season for Maresca to understand the personalities, to develop a bond with the sporting directors, which we're told was built relatively instantaneously, but now they're working together. So it's not just an interview. I think all of us go to interview, and if we get the job or come close, we definitely have a bond and a connection, because there you are trying to fit in and impress. Then when you're in the job and you realize that you're safe, you can obviously start saying, actually, I want to do things a different way. So the dynamic will build over time. And I think from Maresca's perspective, he realizes that what he's inherited is not a complete project, but is coming to that point. Because as I've said many times, this window is the fourth window in a 4-window plan. So at the end of this window, we can say the recruitment has come to phase 1 completion. And then anything else they do, whether they say that the project is done, almost done, continuously evolving, it's the end of that phase 1, which is essentially assess what we've got, buy and sell, reduce the average age, have the incentive-driven wage structure, target new regions like South America, and plan for the future from both a Chelsea point of view and a group perspective. And ultimately, Strasbourg is a part of that at the moment. So once that kind of phase one is complete, not only can we judge them over multiple windows, but we're now heading into a period where even in a long-term model, that 3-year mark is the sort of first juncture for most where you would have a target, even under patient circumstances. 3 to 5 years. I note when PIF took over Newcastle, they said 3 to 5 years, we want to get Champions League football. Jim Ratcliffe comes into Manchester United. He says it's not all going to happen overnight, but I've got a 5-window plan, which again crosses over 3 summer windows and thus 3 years. Chelsea are there now at some point between this summer and summer 2025. So it becomes a fair time to say this isn't a new project anymore. It's been around long enough that you would expect to see some tangible progress, which is ultimately qualifying for the Champions League and winning trophies. And therefore, when Maresca says trust the process, I think he realizes it's more advanced than Pochettino or Potter or obviously Tuchel inherited. And with it being more advanced is obviously more pressure, because he can't just walk in like Tuchel or Potter and say, wait a minute, you don't have sporting directors, you don't have a recruitment team, you don't have a revamped medical department, you don't have enhanced data, you don't have the players that we need in key positions, you've not lowered the average age. So as you flash back in hindsight, we can say it was a real challenge for Potter and Tuchel because of so much change. But now it's settled. So Maresca will be glad, I think, because he probably doesn't believe he's walked into something that is so new he can't handle it, or is so new that it won't start a bit more stable than under previous managers.
I mean, let's talk about that though, right? Because, and I see your argument on, the fact that this is a little bit more advanced now, that it's still not quite at like phase one completion. I don't know how many phases it's going to take. But he's going to have challenges, right? Now, not all of that stuff is under his control, which is very obvious. I think you just mentioned like 15 people that are involved to get this thing to where it needs to go, right? So what is, look, he's now 3 days in, right? What is his biggest challenge between now and the first preseason game, do you think? Is it assessment? Is it just the timeline that exists when there are international tournaments over a summer? Like what's your sense, without having had the chance to get the full media interview style yet, to make this work in admittedly not that much time?
Yeah, I think the number one challenge is turning the data into a tangible starting 11. And I mean specifically starting 11, because we all know the players and the squad and the new signings, and some of the recruitment will be part of a bigger picture plan that ultimately he inherits, and others he'll have inputs, such as Kiernan Desbury-Hall, where he can say, yes, we should move ahead with that because I know the player well. But when you go from Leicester to Chelsea, it's a bigger squad, it's bigger egos, it's a lot more talent. And he has to get his head around those selection headaches and pick a consistent 11, presuming that the vast majority of the squad are fit. And he has to do that by taking all the data and all the theoreticals that he's dived into pretty much since interview, and then meet these players and quickly establish how he's going to fit them in to what is a very rigid system. And unlike maybe Pochettino and Potter, who tinkered a little bit, when Maresca establishes his starting 11, I don't think there'll be that much rotation, because that's not the kind of manager that he is. And it's a challenge, because if, for example, you pick on form right now, presuming everyone's fit, and looking at the back half of the season, you'd have Petrovic in goal. You might have Gusto ahead of Reece James, even though we know that a fit Reece is going to supplant him. You definitely have Chalobah. There's an argument that Badiashile could come in instead of Levi Colwell. You would definitely have Cucurella, Caicedo and Gallagher, probably not Enzo. You have to work out if you're going to play Palmer wide right or behind the striker. But if it is Palmer behind Nicholas Jackson, then that means no Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall. In likelihood, that means Nkunku or Noni Madueke on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, you've got to make a straight call between Mudryk and Sterling, and neither of them were that consistent. Whereas if you just go theoretical and say, who are the assets, who have got the highest ceilings, who are the real stars, that theoretically, but not based on what we saw last season due to injuries or form, who's that 11? It's very different because it's likely Sanchez in goal, it's James over Gusto, it's Fofana and Colwell. Cucurella probably keeps his place. It's Enzo and Moises Caicedo. Again, you've got to work out what to do with Cole Palmer and Christopher Nkunku and maybe Jackson, and then in likelihood Mudryk. But there's also not a strong case on that left-hand side. So those two 11s for me are very different. 5, 6 different players in each of them, the form versus the theoretical form. And he's going to have to decide that very quickly because this is a rigid system. And even though it's a 4-3-3, so people will say they'll take to it very quickly, it's going to take time for the players to understand a few key points. Which fullback is he going to invert? And at Leicester, it was the right fullback, but I think logically at Chelsea, it'll be the left fullback. Then the number 8 has to really be an advanced 8 or a 10. So does he chuck in Dewsbury-Hall or does he say to Palmer, that's your role? Or, again, coming back to what I said before, if he inverts the left, it means the right's getting forwards in wide areas, which means if Cole Palmer plays wide right, he's got more freedom to go central because of the fact the right fullback is wide. So this is why, logically, I think left is inverted. You've got Cucurella, you've got Vega, technically Chilwell as well, even Levi Colwell. So that's a consideration in all of this. But it's a lot for the players to get to grips to. It's a patient build-up. It's wingers over wide forwards, ideally. It's one fullback inverted. And there's pressure on the two deeper midfielders to be both destroyers and metronomes. And then, as I say, the 8 has to basically be a 6 at times, but also an 8, but also a 10. And there's a lot of pressure on output in that role. So there's all manner of practical considerations. And at the moment, Maresca's really just got data. And he's going to have to decide what his strongest 11 is quickly. And then I think he'll stick to it relatively rigidly.
All right, we're going to take our first ad break, come back and talk a little bit about the players who are already in camp. Thank you to the sponsors, and we'll be right back. Ben, you mentioned that, maybe unlike Poch, and we were both on tour last summer, to kind of see him tinker with many different formats, many different lineups, promote a few youngsters early because of injuries or, summer rest or whatever. I was looking at the squad and it feels a lot more complete at this stage than it has the last couple of summers. Obviously, there are some players who are still playing international tournaments or who are just, taking their summer, break. They're like standard 30 days off that they get. But you have a pretty set squad already. When they were showing the videos coming in, it's like, oh, Reece James is back. Great. Christopher Nkunku's back. Malo Gusto's back. Jackson's back. Lavia seems back and maybe healthy, knock on wood, for the first time. Mudryk came back early from the Euros, even though it technically hasn't been a month since he was unceremoniously knocked out of that weird math in the group stage. You have Dewsbury-Hall already joined. You have Carnes back. You have Madueke back. Chalobah. I mean, like, Raheem Sterling's already back. Chilwell's back. Like, it felt like over the last few summers that it wouldn't have been until late July or even early August before the whole complement of stars would be back. Now, of course, you're still missing Enzo and Cuckoo and some others from this group. But it's a pretty robust group to start with. I mean, you're talking about deciding first 11s, outside of a couple of pieces that are still, outstanding. I'm sure I'm missing a couple, but you guys get the point. It feels like this is a much more complete start to a summer than we've had in some time. Do you get that vibe?
Yeah, I think so. And it's good news for Maresca. It's bad news for some players like Levi Colwell, Ben Chilwell, who would have liked to be with England and going all the way. But the ultimate priority is that club form. And those kind of players, much like Marcus Rashford at Manchester United, have to focus on turning around their international chances by impressing Maresca. And the more thorough pre-season they can have, the more impact they can have, which will ultimately benefit their international chances. There's a slight irony with Levi Colwill in the sense we've seen Kieran Trippier play on the wrong side. We've seen Luke Shaw injured. We've seen Mark Gay suspended. And all you can think with that combination of events coupled with Harry Maguire's injury is England desperately need a left-sided defender that can play centre-back or left-back. And still, Levi Colwill didn't go. But it means, as you say, a very settled squad. And I think they're going to come back hungry. And even though there's a managerial change, I think the momentum there with the playing group is important. And it's one of those where Pochettino's work may not have all been apparent at the time, but it will have a knock-on effect. I think back to my club, and under Nigel Pearson, Leicester had this great escape, and then Pearson got rather unceremoniously axed because there were all manner of things going on behind the scenes that I won't get into, but you can Google them and get that full picture. But it was a surprise at the time. And then in comes Claudio Ranieri, and the players were kind of just on autopilot. And players like Wes Morgan and Robert Huth have told me before that it was as much about that playing group just being fit, not getting injured, and the Pearson momentum carrying them over. And even though the style changed, as it will under Maresca, and even though Riyad Mahrez, for example, got given more freedom, and that was a big part of Leicester going on to win the Premier League title, the players feel that as good as Ranieri was as a manager and a character, they were on autopilot. And that's my sense at Chelsea at the moment, that this playing group is on autopilot because they've started to realise Cole Palmer has ice cool veins. And if you let him play, he'll take control on the field. Nicholas Jackson started to score and he's confident. And that swagger is back because he's a very confident figure off the field. So as soon as that translates to his football, he's going to have the same Palmer-like swagger. You can tell from Noni Madueke as well. There's a real flair about him. And again, that's on and off the field. And when you have that and things are not going right, it can translate to little things like the farcical penalty argument that we saw in the Everton game. But if they get into autopilot, that same swagger, that same self-belief, that same confidence is going to be vital. And it's young players realising that they can take control. And if they help Maresca out in that way, and he also coaches them well, they can hit the ground running. And this is why pre-season is going to be so important.
So 2 questions, and then we'll kind of move on to the business of the day. Of the new boys that have joined, which one will benefit most from an entire summer training program? And then, so if that's new boys, then I would say of the folks who were injured most of last season, which is going to benefit most from an entire summer? Because, for guys like Nicholas Jackson, who were healthy most of the year, like my instinct is that they're ready to fire and ready to go. But I think those 2 groups are going to be interesting as you look at what the business Chelsea have already done this summer, and for the folks who feel like new signings who are just coming back from long-term injuries.
Yeah, I think Wesley Fofana is going to be the big beneficiary because he's kind of just sat and watched the vast majority of this new project under Clearlake Bowley and was signed with a big reputation and for a big fee. And he could be an absolutely vital addition. Luckily, Chelsea have always had good options in that position, but I think Fofana will be the big beneficiary because he's just watched and been so hungry for so long. Whereas Levi Colwill was injured between like March and May, but he was still playing regular games. And it wasn't only the injury. Levi Colwill, by either playing out of position or when he moved back to left centre-back, just didn't look quite the same kind of player that he was at Brighton, at least not in terms of consistency, but everyone knows the potential is there. So Wesley Fofana is the big beneficiary in my mind. I suppose technically we could say Christopher Nkunku, but I'm kind of classifying him as fit in inverted commas because he was back by the end of the season. And then new signing wise, I think it's Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, simply because he's got the head start. He's the one that doesn't really need the preseason under Enzo Maresca. He understands the philosophy, the tactics. He's played in that role before, and he'll be aware that Connor Gallagher could depart. So the most interesting thing for Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall in terms of how he can benefit is if Maresca chooses a like-for-like player in that role, because then he might get game time. He might be the one that helps teach others how the system works. He might be able to hit the ground running. And if he does so, he'll continue his very strong attacking numbers and prove to be a really inspired signing. Whereas the other theory is that Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall is there, but that role won't be the same as it was at Leicester, because he'll take a player like Palmer or Nkunku or Carney Chukwuemeka, who are more natural attackers. Because Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall at Leicester started out as a bog-standard central midfielder. He got box-to-box sometimes. He barely scored a goal in the Premier League. He was relatively conservative. His progressive passing numbers were not particularly strong, but he could win the ball and he could keep hold of the ball. But he was quite a safe player, and he had stamina and athleticism, and he tracked back. Now, obviously, that Leicester team in the Premier League, particularly in his last season, were going down. They didn't have that much of the ball. So you can understand why a Championship Leicester that are like a Chelsea, but in the Championship, in the sense they're right there at the top, they're dominating. And that's what's quite interesting about Dewsbury-Hall and Championship, because he's had that full season where the metrics will be very similar to at Chelsea. If you'd assign Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall from a relegated Leicester team, then it'd be very hard to understand how he might succeed at Chelsea, because you would have only seen him playing in a more defensive role. You would have seen him playing with a team with less of the ball. But you can actually compare Leicester finishing first in the Championship with what Chelsea are looking for now, metrics-wise. And you can say, well, here's what Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall did when Leicester had more of the ball. Here's how many goals and assists he got. Here's more of an advanced position he was able to take up. So he might benefit from that, because Maresca might like the fact that that's just an immediate, natural slot in. The only downside is if Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, or of course Carney Chukwuemeka, or even Connor Gallagher takes that role, the first question you ask is, how do you then fit Nicholas Jackson, who's still likely to be the number one striker, Christopher Nkunku and Cole Palmer into a front line if one of them isn't in that final midfield spot? And that's a conundrum. Perhaps Jackson could go wide left, Nkunku could go in the centre, Palmer could go wide right, but then you've got the challenge of Mudryk that they've invested in, or Sterling, who should benefit in this Maresca system, because at Manchester City he was a proper touchline, white chalk on the boots winger.
He would be mine. I think Sterling's going to have a really good summer. Just a shout for Kate Price, who said, I think you answered this earlier with the phases of the plan, but she's mentioned here, will Chelsea actually make progress towards greatness? One word answer. Will Chelsea make progress towards greatness this season, Ben?
Yes.
Okay, I'm
is. I'm quite confident in Chelsea. I just think you have to define greatness. So that's more than a word. But greatness at Chelsea is trophies. Greatness at Chelsea is Champions League as a bare minimum. And greatness for Chelsea as an anomaly this season is to go and win the Club World Cup. And I think I said this on a previous show, but aim number 1, Champions League. Aim number 2, Club World Cup. And the reason for that it's higher than the Europa Conference League or the FA Cup or League Cup, is not just because of the prestige, but you get roughly, and this is all still being debated and is a point of contention, but the expectation is it'll be a minimum entry package of about 40 million quid. But then if you win the Club World Cup, that number triples. So Chelsea have got big incentive in a season without Champions League football to succeed in the Club World Cup, to go and win a trophy. And financially, it's deemed as very important as well. So greatness is now not about Chelsea showing potential. Greatness this season should, in my view anyway, be defined as Chelsea winning trophies.
Absolutely. We will take our last ad break and talk all transfers next, guys. So stick around and we'll be right back. All right, Ben, a couple of things happened since we last chatted with you. Felt like last week kind of ended on a high. So as reported, Chelsea signed Renato Vega at the end of last week. And so that's obviously, I think, still being formally processed, but feels like a done deal at this point. We did a whole scouting special on Vega. It seems like a very, adaptable player who can kind of play in the center of defense on the left, or even in maybe kind of a defensive midfield sort of role if needed. Certainly kind of seems like a Malo Gusto type of signing, in the respect that this was a kind of not a lauded player before we got into the summer, but seems like a alternative maybe for Calafiore, who seems destined for Arsenal at this point. Is that your kind of instinct on Vega and how he might factor into the numbers at Chelsea?
Yeah, I think the best way to describe him is a Malo Gusto for the left-hand side, and bringing in someone that's at a staggered age to what you've got to allow them to compete for the now and have a pathway for the future. And in addition to that, the fact that Chelsea have signed somebody and the medical is taking place as we speak, the second part. So the expectation is that that will be announced sooner rather than later. Maybe by the time people are even watching this, it will be official. But the fact that they're looking for that versatile mold of player that can go left back, inverted left back, left centre back, and defensive midfield is again more evidence, because it's not going to be loaned out anywhere, that Chelsea are going to invert that left side because they're well equipped in the form of Cucurella and Vega, plus Chilwell has played in midfield before. It remains to be seen how he would take to an inverted role, because in midfield he's perhaps been in wider areas. But you've got three options, four if you include Levi Colwill, on that left side. And all four are versatile, and all four can play at fullback, and all four may be able to invert, and two of them are natural inverters. So I think you've got Cucurella as your number one, and then you've got Vega as your number two, which does call into question Chilwell, because Chilwell is the vice captain of the football club and he is above Vega in terms of development, but is he the right fit for that role? So it'll be interesting to see how Chilwell's used and whether or not he falls down the pecking order or whether there's a different kind of role for him. And it's strange, isn't it? Because when Chelsea had all these injuries for ages and ages and ages, particularly under Tuchel's few months and then Graham Potter, it was all about if only Reece James and Ben Chilwell can be fit and play together. And now you could actually make an argument that without James, Malo Gusto is a phenomenal replacement who will push him consistently for game time. And everyone that watches Cucurella back end of last season inverting under Pochettino, plus at the Euros, now thinks what an inspired signing that is for Chelsea Football Club. So we have a slightly different perspective. And now I think that what Chelsea are just looking for is to have these two players minimum in each of these core positions. So in a maybe 70 to 80 game season, if you include a run in the Club World Cup, they've got cover, and that helps rotate a little bit and get everybody game time. And then they've got the depth there. So it is still a work in progress, but by the same token, you can now list a formation with two, if not three players in most of these core positions, and virtually all of them are under the age of 25. So if they work, then naturally you would expect in the coming windows after this summer, the recruitment to slow down a little bit.
One for the future, however, is Chelsea agreeing with Atlanta United on Caleb Wiley. This has been out there for a little bit, and it kind of calmed down and then kind of resurfaced again, Ben. This is an expectation for this player to go to Strasbourg on loan and to start their kind of European experience, kind of a talent that I think is widely regarded as one of the best in MLS and could potentially really develop into a strong bit of competition in the future for someone like Viega. What is your sense on this? Obviously, your colleague Tom Bogart, who's really tapped into the MLS market over here, wrote this piece. But is this one where Chelsea feel like they're getting a steal and are just kind of storing that away for safekeeping for later?
More than a steal, I think, because if they thought that 8.5 million was value, but they were of the belief that a pathway through Strasbourg was needed first, they'd have just signed him under Bluco for Strasbourg. But this is a 7-year contract, which is a massive belief in the player and for Chelsea. Even though we heard some reports that it was for Strasbourg, it's not. It's a Chelsea deal, and then it's a loan to Strasbourg. Now, maybe it turns out that they keep loaning to Strasbourg, or if it doesn't work at Chelsea, you've got the opportunity to then move the player. But for now, he's a Chelsea player at 19 years of age on a 7-year contract. So I think you're right in part, and much like Mark Gahey, the fee is low enough that they obviously feel like whatever happens, whether the player succeeds at Chelsea, succeeds at Strasbourg, or is sold, they're not going to lose money. And it's opportunism, therefore, in the market. But Callum Wiley is very highly rated, and he's an extremely intelligent footballer who, again, can invert. And he has a couple of caps for the US men's national team and will be off to the Olympics as well. So Chelsea like the fact that he'll go to Paris, he'll play in the Olympics, he'll gain experience, then he'll go to Strasbourg and they'll be able to take stock of him at a later date. But you don't hand out a 7-year Chelsea deal unless you do have that long-term belief that the player might be able to fight his way into Chelsea contention. So this isn't quite a group signing and only with Strasbourg in mind. This is almost Chelsea having their cake and eating it and sending the player to Strasbourg to develop, buying him at what they believe to be a steal, and then giving him a long-term enough contract that if all goes according to plan, he may well force his way into the Chelsea reckoning over the coming years.
One that was kind of, I think, bantered about over the kind of early hours of Monday and even Sunday was Chelsea losing a really talented academy player in Rio Nemua as a move to Liverpool was set up. This is one that I think Chelsea had really high hopes for. Ended last season on a bang, and I think was maybe one of the brighter prospects in the academy. Obviously, there's been a lot of movement within the academy recently with Neil Bath and Jim Fraser leaving as well. Do you think all of that is connected, or do you think that these are kind of one-off circumstances that happen and it just kind of feels like there might be more there than it is?
I think any young player wants pathways, and Liverpool were able to offer a really strong pathway to Rio, who's an unreal talent. So it is a really big coup as far as Liverpool are concerned, and Chelsea didn't want to lose the player. But Liverpool were able to offer him a place in the under-18 squad, to my knowledge, and that will help with his development. And then he sees within the senior squad age a pathway through to the first team. So Chelsea's academy has undergone huge upheaval. We know that Neil Bath, Jim Fraser have departed, two Chelsea stalwarts, fantastic at the jobs that they've done for Chelsea and very sorely missed. Yet, Chelsea have got big plans that Joe Shields is driving to revamp the academy. And that might take a little bit of time, of course. And when you're a top talent, you're always going to be in demand. And I think the only downside with Chelsea's model is by buying so many young players and having such a young squad age, if you're in that bracket of kind of 14 to 18 and you were already at the academy when Clearlake Bowley came in, you start to feel like they're buying people in your age group or around your age group, or that these 18 to 21-year-olds are going to have longevity and are going to be in the first team for 5 to 7 years. So if you're 14, 15, 16, 17, not only may you think there's too many players in your position to get into the first team, even if you back yourself, but you also maybe feel you're that lost generation, for want of a better word, that will not be like typical of Chelsea. And I think that's the thing that people don't always understand, because they look at it now and they say, why are we prioritizing buying young talent when we've got young talent? Why are we prioritizing buying so many players when we've already got a lot of young prospects? And that's absolutely fine to say. And many of these young prospects like Rio may go on to do wonderful things. And we know in the past there's been plenty of players that have left Chelsea at different points, like Kevin De Bruyne, Mo Salah, that have gone on to do wonderful things. So ultimately, this is just football, and you can't always be definitive with every single young teenager, because they will have other options on the table and their development is never guaranteed. So hindsight will always be a wonderful thing. But I think, like I said before, Chelsea will get to a point where they stop just buying, because the foundations of their youth-led project are there. And then they'll start to go even younger and look at academy recruitment of local talent or players that they can bring in far younger and far less publicized than now. Because at the moment, it's all about 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and everyone gets really excited because they can be dropped straight in whenever they arrive at the club. But after that, it will be more about how are we recruiting, who are we recruiting, and who have we got coming through in that age bracket of maybe 10 to 15, long before media glare, long before any hype. And rightly so, by the way, because we have to be responsible with how we report about ultimately young kids and not just chuck them in the limelight too young and overhype them when they do routine things like join an academy. It only really gets to the hype part, I think, when they sign a professional contract or when they're integrated into the first team squad. But that aside, if they target the academy next, then the generation below this generation, which is ultimately Rio's that we're talking about, will all be pulled in with the same feeling there's a pathway. Whereas now it feels like they've doubled up and they've basically said, we've got these academy players and they're all coming through and they're all approaching their high teens. But at the same time, we're going to buy a bunch of high teens to make sure that we don't just tap into what we've got. And the local market, we look at France, we look at South America, we look who we can poach from other clubs. That won't be an every window occurrence, because as they've laid those foundations, they'll go back a generation and look at smart recruitment much younger. And then those players will come in with the pathway promise and the belief that they're part of the project. Whereas I sense some of the existing academy players maybe think that they've been lost as part of this project. So then when Liverpool come calling for Rio, they're maybe just able to offer him not only improved terms, but a clearer pathway through the under-18s to the first team. And that's why he chose to make the move. I don't think it was an easy decision. I think Chelsea are disappointed that he's left for Liverpool. But with a player that age and that talent, it's always a scenario that can happen. And I think he will go on to do really top things in football.
Let's talk about some outgoings and incomings to kind of wrap this one up, Ben. I think there's still a lot of smoke around Connor as it pertains to what happens with him this summer. Atletico Madrid remain interested, kind of per Fabrizio, and I'm sure your own reporting as well. Any notes on Connor as the summer's progressed? He's obviously been with England this entire time, so it's felt like maybe a little quiet on that front.
Yeah, Connor's focused on England. The Connor perspective and the Chelsea perspective are two slightly different things. So Connor Gallagher's going to return. We know he's Chelsea through and through. He'll speak to Enzo Maresca, and then he'll have a clearer sense of if he is or isn't a stylistic fit and whether he's going to fall down the pecking order. And I think, as I've said many times, if Chelsea fans do their best 11 theoretically with everyone fit and everyone judged on the high ceilings that they've got, 50% of Chelsea fans might put Gallagher in there and 50% may not be able to fit him into the system. So Gallagher will assess and will not be rushed, and Chelsea will leave his situation open-ended until the window shuts. If the window shuts, then they can determine whether or not they want to then engage in more advanced talks surrounding a new deal. But for now, Chelsea are kind of braced for offers, which haven't yet come in any formal sense. And Gallagher doesn't want to be distracted. And the three clubs are the same at the moment to watch with Gallagher. We have Aston Villa, who have lost Douglas Luiz and might be able to put a reasonable proposal together if they sell John Duran. But that is an if. And at the moment, they're not in a financial position to move. Then you have Tottenham with the longest standing interest in Gallagher, but a valuation of between 35 and 40 million pounds. And on top of that, Atletico Madrid, who to my knowledge made a verbal and very informal offer of 20 million pounds plus bonuses. And everything that has been presented to Chelsea historically, right through to now, formally or verbally, has been miles below their valuation. And Chelsea argue very simply, Mason Mount went to Manchester United for 55 million, 1 year left on his contract. Connor Gallagher, in form, England international, captain Chelsea, 1 year left on the contract, 50 to 55 million. So that's the yardstick Chelsea are using, in the same way that Everton are saying to Manchester United, we want close to 80 million. You bought Harry Maguire from Leicester for close to 80 million. And no one's met that valuation. So this is why we're in Gallagher limbo. And this is why every update is kind of a non-update at this stage. But when Gallagher returns from the Euros, he'll get a clearer sense. And although he'd like to stay at Chelsea and will fight to stay at Chelsea, if it's clear that his game time is going to be diminished, he'll have an important decision to make, because he'll know if in 12 months' time he's not playing that much and not as important to Chelsea, it will impact his chances of making selection for the 2026 World Cup for England as well. With Atleti, a lot of people ask me as well whether Samu is being factored into the talks. And I'm told not at this stage. So from Chelsea's point of view, if they could do two separate deals and get Samu and then sell Gallagher, they'd be open to that. But from Atleti's point of view, if they move for Gallagher and nothing has advanced yet, but the interest is concrete, they still want to keep Samu. And then with Samu, Chelsea have spoken and bid more than one time for him, but only to the ballpark of 45 million euros. And my understanding is that Atleti wants 60 million euros as a minimum, but they don't want to actually sell the player. So there may become a financial offer where they decide to change their mind because it's too good to turn down, and that would be 60 million euros or more. But the starting point of Atleti is they just don't want to sell the player. And what complicates that situation is that the player's changed agents and is now primarily represented by his mother. But the old agent has a very strong relationship and is still involved. And the old agent had put together a renewal for Samu, and Atleti still feel that he'll sign that. And then there will be a release clause of 120 million euros and the chapter will be over. But because of the change to his mother's representation, Chelsea have got a window of opportunity where, even though the old agent is still involved and Atleti are trying to get that over the line, the mother or the player may have their head turned by Chelsea. And this is why Chelsea are still engaged to see whether anything is possible with Samu, even with the arrivals of Mark Gahey and Amari Kellyman. We wait and see whether anything progresses, because Atleti are still quite optimistic that Samu will stay, and they're quite pessimistic that they can afford Connor Gallagher. But there are active talks at the moment between Chelsea and Atletico Madrid, so it could be one to watch in the coming weeks.
All right, let's rapid fire a few of the outgoing potentials. Anything new on Lukaku?
Lukaku in Saudi, and there are 3 Saudi clubs, I'm told, that are actively considering Lukaku. It would likely be a central deal. So what they do is they put in their request to the Ministry of Sport. The ministry will allocate a club, and then things will start to progress. And Chelsea know that they can get that £38 million or 45 million euros from the Saudi side. And whereas 12 months ago, Al Hilal were the club to have an offer accepted, now we're looking at Al Ahly, Al Shabab, and the newly promoted Aramco-owned side Al Qadsiya. And things are evolving within the Saudi infrastructure quite slowly, because we've had Eid. The window in Saudi doesn't open until the 17th of July, and all of the clubs are only setting up European bases because they want to be on a European time zone. So in the next week or two, and as the Saudi window opens, Chelsea are likely to get something from the Saudi side. And then Napoli's the other club to watch, because we know that Giovanni Manna, the new sporting director of Napoli, liked Lukaku for Juventus 12 months ago. And Antonio Conte also rates Lukaku, but they're not going to pay the same kind of price as Saudi Arabia. So it's up to Lukaku to decide whether he finally wants to take that Saudi money, and Chelsea would welcome that, or whether he wants to stay in Italy.
You mentioned a little bit about Kepa on Twitter the other day. What's your thoughts on Kepa potentially leaving the club this summer?
So Al Ittihad in Saudi Arabia were right on the brink of making Chelsea a formal offer for Kepa. And the expectation from Chelsea's perspective is that Kepa will go. And then about 5 days ago, the Al Ittihad president, Loïc Nazar, resigned. And there's all manner of stories flying around from sources. But in essence, there's been a strategic disagreement. And this is a slow process, because when you resign in Saudi Arabia, you tell your club's board, they accept it. In this case, they go to wider PIF, they have to accept it. Then they have to put the resignation to the Ministry of Sport, and they have to accept it. So there can always be twists and turns, and there'll be a new election as well. But at that point, you had Stefano Pioli set to sign, and you had Al Ittihad wanting a goalkeeper and realising that Al Nassr are moving on Ederson, so they decided that Kepa would be a concrete possibility. And right at that point when things might have moved, all of this boardroom drama happened. And now it looks like Laurent Blanc is going to be the new Al Ittihad manager. And we wait and see whether there's any other casualties or resignations or departures with what appears to be a board upheaval. So Kepa's on ice, and it remains to be seen whether Saudi will come. And therefore, there's no active other suitor, to my knowledge, that has put a proposal to Chelsea. So I think this one might drag on a few weeks now. But the reality of the situation is that, as it stands, Enzo Maresca is planning to choose between Rob Sanchez and Georgi Petrovic as his number one, and Kepa's not being factored in. So the expectation is still that Kepa will leave between now and the end of the window. But Al Ittihad has a question mark by it all of a sudden.
Is there any firm interest in Ben Chilwell? You mentioned that could be kind of an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, we've heard these rumours, haven't we, with Ben Chilwell and Manchester United. That's not my understanding at this stage. I think Manchester United, if they bring in a left-back, are going to go a little bit younger. And Milos Kirkos, who could also be a Chelsea target, remains one to watch. Obviously, with Caleb Wiley and Renato Vega coming in, it maybe becomes less likely now that Chelsea will even look at another left-sided player. But with Chelsea, you just never know. They could technically say Vega is defensive midfield or left-sided centre-back. And then if Chilwell was to depart, you might have room to bring in somebody like a Milos Kirkos because Wiley's on loan at Strasbourg. But right now, they're once again well-stocked in that particular position. So I think Manchester United are looking for a slightly younger specialist left-back. And I think from Ben Chilwell's perspective, he still sees himself as very important on and off the field. Vice captain, we presume at least, of the football club. Because remember, the decision around captain and vice captain was not just Pochettino. It had input from the sporting directors as well. So you would imagine the sporting director's perspective is exactly the same. And therefore, Reece James captain, Ben Chilwell vice captain. So anything with Manchester United at this stage would still have to develop if there's substance to it, because the Chilwell camp and Chelsea have not yet had any kind of approach from Manchester United. And Manchester United are focused on trying to get in two centre-backs. In addition, they want a central midfielder, and Joshua Zirkzee is on the brink of joining. And then there's a question mark at the time of recording as to whether Mason Greenwood's deal to Marseille will get done. The mayor of Marseille spoke very negatively about it, so there's been backlash. But if Marseille can agree terms with Greenwood and he goes, they'll have a little bit of budget, but they still probably have to sell somebody like Jadon Sancho to be able to afford a couple of these other players. And if they get that money, it might go to a Branthwaite along with De Ligt, or it might go on an Ugarte, a former Chelsea target. So spending the money required to sign Ben Chilwell is basically out of Manchester United's budget at the time of recording. And that's why I think it's more likely that Chilwell just stays at Chelsea.
Is there a surprise offer from someone by the end of the window for Cucurella?
I just think Chelsea, if they've got any sense anyway, would be auto-rejecting anything for Cucurella at this point. It's going to be very difficult if Chelsea sell Cucurella to make any money, because the total package that they paid to Brighton was in excess of 60 million. And right now he's looking like £100 million player. So to turn around to a form player who might win the Euros, I hope not, of course, because we want England to win it. But if Cucurella wins the Euros and finish the season in form under Pochettino, and Maresca's going to invert the left side, then Cucurella is your starting left back, in my opinion. It's up to Maresca. My opinion is ultimately worthless. But if it was my choice, Cucurella is the clear candidate above Chilwell and above Vega and above Colwell, were he to be considered in that position, to be the starting left back. So it would be normal for clubs to try their luck off the back of a positive Euros if they thought that Chelsea were open. And if this was January and when Manchester United were discussing Cucurella on loan, then absolutely. And there has been an expectation, if we flash back 6 months or 12 months, to the possibility that Marc Cucurella might be somebody that Chelsea would be prepared to sell at the right price. But I would imagine that now Maresca has a very different opinion. And I would personally be surprised if Cucurella goes between now and the end of the window. In terms of suitors, Manchester United still like the player. And Manchester City, remember, before Chelsea signed Cucurella, were in for Cucurella as well. They just didn't want to pay more than 35 million. And most people in the industry raised eyebrows when Chelsea decided to agree on such a high package with Brighton. So there are Premier League clubs that still like Cucurella, and were he to be available at value and given his form, would probably move for Cucurella. But I just think, speaking to sources at the moment, Chelsea are no longer planning for a Cucurella exit.
Is there a surprise sale from someone that we haven't regularly talked about that could be on the horizon for Chelsea?
I think there's a couple that we should keep an eye on. Carney Chukwuemeka is one. We know that Milan have a very early interest in him. And again, Chelsea are not looking to sell Cucurella, but for the right price, they certainly might consider it. I think Alfie Gilchrist will go on loan, and it wouldn't sit well with the Chelsea fan base if he was sold. But the reality of the situation is Chelsea have kind of got too many centre-backs for a back four, if you include all players, including Gilchrist. And I know that he can also play on the right-hand side. So it wouldn't surprise me if Gilchrist goes on loan, most likely to the Championship, Preston in particular, but Leeds and Blackburn as well, as I've reported previously, are interested. If he does well there, it's going to go one or two ways, right? Number one, he follows the exact same path as Levi Colwill from Huddersfield, and then he went to Brighton. So maybe Gilchrist goes to a Championship club, comes back, does another loan, and then is in a position where he can force his way more regularly into the first team squad. But if it gets to the point where he doesn't excel in the next 2 years, then there's going to be plenty of clubs that want to take a gamble on him or want to buy him, whether Premier League or Championship. So I don't think Chelsea right now, if any of these Championship clubs came calling, would say, we're going to sell Alfie Gilchrist. It's going to be a loan, and Chelsea are going to want to see him develop. But there's definitely growing interest in Alfie Gilchrist. And I think if you're Gilchrist, you have to understand in the next few years where your pathways are. And I would also keep an eye on Benoit Badiashile, because you're going to get this natural situation where in a back four, there's going to be a starting two. Let's just call it, for the sake of the argument, Wesley Fofana, Levi Colwill. And then every other centre-back at the club. We've mentioned Gilchrist, Badiashile, Disasi, Tosin, although he's been promised game time and is new, so can be taken out of this particular point I'm making. But somebody's going to come in for some of these players if their game time is diminished, particularly the ones that maybe played towards the back end of the season and then get less game time heading into the next season. It would still be a surprise if any of them go this window, but maybe January or maybe summer 2025, those kind of players will suddenly come on the market. And then the one I think I can rule out at this stage, or I will say 95% rule out, is Noni Madueke. And we constantly hear links with either a loan or a permanent move away. And it's absolutely true that Newcastle like Noni Madueke. And if they felt they could move for Noni Madueke at value, they would. But my understanding is that Chelsea are not looking to sanction a permanent Noni Madueke exit this summer. So that would be a surprise if he ends up going. But you're looking at these kind of players where suitors see the size of Chelsea's squad, not necessarily a balloon squad size like under Graham Potter, but well stocked in certain positions such as centre-back, and they start to just plan and make their inquiries, because even if Chelsea want to keep one or two, the odd player might be unsettled with diminished game time, and that's where we might get a few surprises. And right now, I think Chelsea have got the most competition for centre-back and for that 8 role, because the 8 is kind of available to an attacking midfielder, an 8 that's advanced, an 8 that's a 10, a second forward, false 9 type forward, a wide right winger that prefers to play centrally, or a player like Connor Gallagher that can play as a 6 or as an 8. So in that position and at centre-back, there's just a lot of competition, and there's bound to be a top talent within those positions that eventually decides that they need to go elsewhere to get game time. Whether or not it's this summer, it remains to be seen, but sooner rather than later, that is just the knock-on effect of a big club with a lot of top talent when they realise that they're falling down the pecking order.
Let's quickly talk about incomings, because it feels like Chelsea have done quite a bit of business already this summer. Maybe not the big names that we're used to seeing, a lot of sort of future prospects and things like that. What are your thoughts around striker? Is it Samu and nobody else, or are there a couple of other names at striker that are still being mooted? We've seen Isak, rumored all year, although the finances seem impossible on something like that. Like, what's your sense?
Yeah, Isaac was a cursory inquiry, and I'm told by sources it was because the industry generally didn't know whether Newcastle needed 30 million or 100 million. So you take the shot just to see, but it's very much just a phone call. And I think Chelsea understood very quickly that Newcastle were not looking for 100 million. It was more around the 50 to 60 million mark. So then suddenly you think Gordon is their contingency. And if they get Minter and Elliot Anderson over the line as they did, then they're fine. And then Isak becomes untouchable again. So Chelsea can't move for Isak now. There was one tiny window of opportunity where they initiated contact and it wasn't possible because Newcastle didn't want to sell Isak. It's also not true that they offered either Nicholas Jackson or Noni Madueke as part of the deal. I don't think it ever became that advanced to even be talking about the package. I think you pick up the phone, you ask whether or not there's an urgency to sell. Yeah. You get your answer relatively quickly that it's highly unlikely. And at the price that Newcastle are looking for Isak, it's not something that Chelsea want to proceed with. And at the moment, it's the same with Victor Osimhen, who we can rule out unless the price drops significantly. But Napoli's position is still it's the release clause or nothing. There's Saudi interest. And you know what? He might go there. He was tempted by Saudi 12 months ago, and PSG could still be one to watch as well. Samu is a concrete target. My understanding is Chelsea have had multiple bids rejected. We covered this in a previous answer, but it's going to take a minimum, to my knowledge, of 60 million euros. And Jonathan David is the other one to still keep an eye on. You've got Newcastle as the newest suitor to inquire. West Ham could come in that race if they don't progress with John Duran. And I'm not aware of too much positive at the moment on that Duran front because they're running into the same problem as Chelsea, that Villa's asking price is too high. So if it drops below 40 million, maybe they can get it done, but they're not looking to spend what they've just spent on Max Kilman, on John Duran. So West Ham could turn their attention to David. And then I still think that there's very much substance in the Spurs links as well. So David's just at the time of recording, returning from the Copa America. Canada did really well under Jesse Marsch. They got knocked out to Argentina. He'll fly back. And the thing everyone's trying to understand with David is what's his preference and package, because the actual negotiation with Lille will be relatively routine due to the fact he's going to be available for definitely under 30 million and in likelihood a bit closer to 25 million, which is an absolute bargain. And that's just because his contract is running down and Lille want a fee and they've got some financial difficulties. So I think David and Samu are the two to watch. And we know that internally, but only internally at this stage, Dominic Solanke's come up. They're choosing not to move. And he has a relatively expensive release clause at £65 million. Evan Ferguson, discussed as a long-standing target, didn't have a great season last campaign. So again, no active movement on that front. And Rodrigo Muniz at Fulham has come up in conversation as well. But these are just normal internal recruitment meetings. And the real substance to date has come in a bid, in fact, more than one bid, as I say, for Samu, and that inquiry on the player side to the Jonathan David camp.
Is David the most likely striker to come to Chelsea at this moment in time?
Well, I think they would take Samu if they could get Samu still, even with Kelly Mullingahi. But David is that more experienced and at this stage in his career, proven goal scorer. I don't think we can say likely at this stage because Chelsea have not made a formal bid yet to Lille. All they've done is hold exploratory talks on the player camps. So they're getting everything in order in case they wish to move. But if they were worried about the competition and desperately wanted David, you'd expect them to try and get ahead of the market and already place the bid. Because as I say, there'll be multiple Premier League clubs that try for Jonathan David. It'll be a big surprise if we don't see movement on the David front in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I don't think this is going to be a last minute window buy. I think this is going to be a window buy between now and the first week in August. So if Chelsea are going to move, it's going to progress very quickly, but we can't quite say likely at this point, maybe realistic, but likely would imply that they've actually started a club-to-club negotiation or agreed terms with the players, and it's not yet that advanced.
Is there anyone else who you want to cover? It feels like left back is covered for the foreseeable future. It feels like goalkeeper is probably not a priority at this point. attacker winger, maybe. Is there anything else that's out there that you're kind of that's surfaced from your sources?
Yeah, I think there's a few other names that we should just mention. One is Karim Adeyemi, who is currently a winger or a forward for Dortmund. And Chelsea have not advanced it yet, but he's another name that's come up in recruitment meetings, and they've asked for the terms of that kind of deal. He is contracted, to my knowledge, until 2027 and could be available for somewhere in the region of 30 million euros. It might take a few bonuses on top as well. But there is some substance in that one. And sources in Germany still suspect that Chelsea might make a move there. I've mentioned Mitoma before. That was just an internal discussion again. So Brighton are yet to receive any approach. But it's sort of interesting because Mitoma's older. He's a different kind of profile. He breaks the mold a little bit, but he could be dropped straight in and have an impact in the Premier League. Whereas Adeyemi is, again, a younger player, 22 years of age, with a high ceiling ahead of him. And Chelsea may feel that he's available at a relative steal. And once again, before Dortmund, he's come through that same old Red Bull model that Chelsea really love and respect. Salzburg to Dortmund, Dortmund to Chelsea, potentially. So we wait and see if that develops. But there's nothing advanced yet on that front. And then goalkeeper could still be one to watch, because obviously you have a domino effect with goalkeepers, right? So if you're Petrovic, you ended the season thinking, I've secured the number one. And if Pochettino was still there, Petrovic would in likelihood have been the number one. Now the feeling from sources is that Sanchez is the number one. And Chelsea are not going to want to let Petrovic go. So it probably works the right way around. Whereas if Petrovic was the number one, Sanchez might have wanted to move. And then with Kepa departing, you definitely need another goalkeeper. Now, one of the first things we're going to ask Maresca is if he's locked in on his goalkeepers, because we've sort of heard conflicting things from sources. On the one hand, that Chelsea have explored different targets, and on the other hand, that they're very satisfied with their goalkeepers. And my understanding now, things are settling, is that they do want to judge the goalkeepers they've got, particularly Sanchez and Petrovic. And sources lean towards the feeling that Maresca will restore Rob Sanchez to the number one because he's a better fit with this system. And I know Chelsea fans may worry because it's patient build-up and the goalkeeper has to be very composed on the ball. But if you look at Sanchez, he's actually very solid under pressure with short passes in that kind of system with lots of Chelsea shirts around him. Where he lets himself down, I think, is the medium length and the long length clearances, which are a little bit more rash or sliced. And I can tell you categorically, if he starts doing that in games, Maresca will sub him. So this is all about safe, square, diagonal, short passes and being able to come out of your box, not so much as a sweeper keeper, but like a permanent presence, almost just like a sweeper rather than a keeper. And I think Sanchez will take quite well to that, but it remains to be seen. But if they move in the goalkeeper market, we should still keep an eye on James Trafford, because Newcastle have not done a deal for him. And since we were speaking about Newcastle signing James Trafford for somewhere in the region of 20 million, including add-ons, they've brought in two other goalkeepers and they have not reached an agreement with Burnley. So if Chelsea lose a goalkeeper, or if Maresca changes his mind after pre-season and thinks he needs a goalkeeper, then James Trafford might still be one to watch. But I want to be kind of clear that the Chelsea sources I speak to feel like the number one at this stage is Sanchez's to lose.
Yeah, going back to our original question is which players might benefit most from an early preseason. Goalkeepers have to be pretty high on that list. Well, look, Ben, we've obviously done a heck of a job to get through a lot of material here. Really appreciate your time, as always, with everything going on with the transfer window. Maybe feels like Chelsea are kind of tightening up here as we head into the season. Maybe not as much like late activity as we've seen before. Is that your kind of final word?
Yeah, I think my final words are: one, still a right-sided winger or forward, more likely a winger, and still a central forward could be possible. And these are two areas, because we know Chelsea tried for Elise and we know they're still looking at the striker market. So these could be two important additions. Aaron Anselmino is another one that's going to get done. I know a lot of people were asking me, because Wiley's coming in and taking up an international loan with Strasbourg, does that put in doubt the Anselmino deal? It doesn't. The agreement in principle is done, and we just need to wait for confirmation if he's going to go back to Boca for 6 months or a year on loan. If it's only 6 months on loan, the other 6 months might be at Strasbourg. But that's another incoming that I expect to be official sooner rather than later. And then Chelsea women, I wanted to speak about as well, because they're coming over to America. They're playing a couple of games, including Gotham, and I'll be attending that one. And they've been very active in the market. And the big name signing that's getting closer and closer is Lucy Bronze.
Yeah.
And what's kind of interesting about Bronze is that at Barcelona, even though she had the option to extend, she was up against Ona Batlle and felt like her game time would be diminished. Whereas at Chelsea, keep an eye on the fact that she's not only used in that fullback position, but is also moved into midfield as well. And she's done that at different parts of her career as well. But I think the appeal of Chelsea, huge club, obviously highly successful in the women's game, and that ability to be given freedom to play in two different positions is a big factor in her decision making. And if everything goes according to plan and there's no surprise hijack or NWSL side that comes in, Orlando were the ones to watch, then the expectation at the time of recording anyway is that Chelsea women should be able to complete that deal for Lucy Bronze. And that will be a flagship signing and a really exciting one ahead of the new season in the post Emma Hayes era.
That's right. All right, Chelsea fans. That is a wrap on this one. Ben, I'm sure we will talk again very soon because things keep happening, and happening they will for the foreseeable future. But until next time, you know what to do. Keep the blue flag flying high.